Welcome. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, in celebration of Pride Month and Immigration Heritage Month, Hua Wang will be speaking with author Curtis Chin about Curtis's new book, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. My name is Helen Liu, and I'm the Programming and Partnerships Manager at CAAL Library. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the CAAL Library Foundation. Their support enables us to bring programs like tonight's event to you. I'd also like to thank the Chinese American Association of Lexington, CAAL, for their partnership on this program, and United Chinese Americans, UCA, New England Chinese American Alliance, NECAA, and Coalition for Anti-Racism and Equity, CARE, Action Incorporated for their support. The format for the evening will be a conversation between Curtis and Hua. We have saved some time for questions, so have them ready. This program is being recorded and will be posted to the library's YouTube channel. Copies of the author's book is available for purchase online through Bookends in Winchester. I'll add the link to the chat. Copies of the book can also be borrowed from the Minuteman Library Network. Now I'd like to introduce our guests. Graduating with a degree in creative writing, Curtis Chin has written for CNN, Bon Appetit, the Detroit Free Press, and the Boston Globe, as well as for shows on network television. He has received fellowships from ABC, Disney Television, the New York Foundation for the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts. He has won awards from the National Association for Multicultural Education, the National Association for Ethnic Studies, the American Librarians Association, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and serving as a visiting scholar at New York University. Curtis has screened his films with over 600 entities in 16 countries, including the White House, Lincoln Center, Amnesty International, SXSWEDU, and the Government of Norway. He recently completed work on a short documentary on photographer Corky Lee. The film Dear Corky is now available on pbs.com through American Masters. As an organizer, Curtis Chin co-founded the Asian American Writers Workshop, the premier nonprofit dedicated to promoting Asian American writers. He has also worked as Director of Outreach for the Democratic National Committee and has served on Barack Obama's Asian American Leadership Committee during his 2008 presidential campaign. Dr. Hua is currently the Associate Head of Division of Systems Engineering at Boston University. He was a research scientist with United Technologies Research Center, a faculty member with Duke University, and a program manager with the U.S. Army Research Office. He's the co-president of the Chinese American Association of Lexington, CAAL, and has served on the boards of Lexington Historical Society, Carey Memorial Library Foundation, and Community Endowment of Lexington. He's the chair of the National Board of Directors of United Chinese Americans, UCA, a founding co-chair and immediate past president of New England Chinese American Alliance, NECAA, and the president of Coalition for Anti-Racism and Equity, CARE, Action Incorporated. Welcome, Hua and Curtis. We're so excited to get started.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Helen. So, Curtis, it's a great pleasure to have you here. I was thinking about how we met each other, last year at the top of the, View Boston at a NAP event. That bring me to thinking about one of my favorite English words, serendipity, right? And I remember that time you were, going back to Detroit to film a cooking segment. And I was forget about the dish you said the film is going to be about, but maybe you can let us know. And of course, I read your book and I love it. And it's evident that the love of food, and I think, that's also shared with this community and about everybody else, right? So I think, so tonight we're so happy and so eager to have this conversation with you. So without further ado, I will just get back to some of the questions, the burning questions myself and some of our, audience have. So let's start it. So why did you write a memoir? And then you said everything you learned in a Chinese restaurant. What did you learn? Are the lessons you talked about there still relevant for everything you do now? Thank you.
Hey, Hua, Helen, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all the organizations for sponsoring. Just a heads up, if you guys hear an airplane whizzing by, it's not a sound effect thing. I'm actually at the Chicago airport taking this phone call. So thank you for accommodating my schedule. Yeah, so the book is called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. And it's about growing up in my family's restaurant in Detroit. And it was a tough time for my city at that time. It was the 80s. The auto industry was suffering, which led to a lot of anti-Asian bias. But there was also crack cocaine, there was AIDS. I knew 5 people that were murdered by the time I was 18 years old. But despite that, my parents had this wonderful Chinese restaurant that they were able to raise me and siblings. And me writing the book really isn't just about retracing my own journey, my past, but it's also a thank you to my parents giving me and my siblings these wonderful lives. In terms of why I wrote the book, sadly, my dad passed away, and what happened, we had to close the restaurant. And after that, my family all just left Michigan. And now that my siblings started having kids a few years ago, I thought it was really sad that none of these next generation of my family would know this 100-year history in Michigan. And so I really started writing the stories just for them. It was really a personal project. It was only after spending a number of years working on it that I thought, like, I'm spending a lot of time on this. I should probably get paid. And so I thought, like, okay, well, I should try to find an agent and sell the book. And that's how it sort of came about.
Well, that's interesting because you being a prolific writer, but my understanding, this is actually your first book, right? And
Yeah, so
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I do have a writing background. I studied poetry writing at Michigan, and then I went off to New York and won a bunch of fellowships, and then eventually moved out to LA where I became a screenwriter, a TV writer, and I was having a really great career, then. But I made a switch when, again, after my dad passed away, it was a car accident, and it was just shocking to everybody in my family, and that's when I decided that we all had to go back home to, see my mom because she was in the car too. And so we were trying to figure out what to do. And that's when I decided to make a career switch to do these documentaries, these social justice documentaries. And then from there, now I write books. And so, yeah, I've hopped around to a few different genres, but, when I've talked to people about this, I feel like, and this is what I say to people that want to have a job as a professional writer is that oftentimes you don't know where your job opportunities are going to be. Like you can't really dictate the genre, but the one thing you do have control over is your voice, what you want to say, right? How you see the world. And so as long as you are pretty solid about that, then it doesn't really matter what genre you're in, whether it's poetry or TV writing or documentary filmmaking or now a book. It's still my same voice. It's still my same concerns. It's still my same attitude. And so that's the thing that sort of connects all of it.
Exactly. And then since you mentioned, everything you learned, so there's obviously a lot of lessons and also a lot of happiness, right? So I think in the book you mentioned about the Chung's was the happiest place on earth, or not only in Detroit. And so can you say a few things about what are the things, from the book you feel like you truly learned and you like to share with us?
Well, the book is filled with all kinds of little lessons. I mean, some of them are cooking, some of them are life lessons. I mean, it's just a gamut. But the one thing that I love to tell people when they ask me, well, what did you learn growing up in that restaurant? The first thing I say is the earliest lesson, which is, when you're a young person, oftentimes your parents will say, don't talk to strangers. My parents actually gave me the exact opposite advice. They were like, talk to strangers. And who they were talking about were the people in our dining room because my mom didn't have a chance to graduate high school. She had an arranged marriage, had to come to America and get married, never got to finish 12th grade. My dad, had to drop out of community college to work at my family's business. After 2 semesters. So they didn't have a good, strong sense of what other job opportunities might exist outside the 4 walls of that Chinese restaurant. But anytime my dad met someone who did, he would like immediately call all 6 of us kids to run over and barrage these people with questions of, what do you do for a living? How'd you get your job? How much money did you make? And so, that lesson, not being afraid of talking to people who are different from you, not being afraid of asking questions when you don't know the answer, or not being afraid of asking for help. I mean, those are all, great lessons that I feel like I've taken with me.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting, right? That's a typically, I think you mentioned something, your mom's advice about it, like work hard, stay quiet, and obey the elders, right? See, you
Yeah,
know,
that was my mom's mantra. Work
that's
hard,
right.
obey the elders, and be quiet.
Yeah. And so you already touched upon some of this, but I think maybe you can say a bit more about your writing journeys. I already mentioned about your word writing for these, from poetry to documentaries. In your own words, I think you said something about, you have had a long journey as a writer. So perhaps you can, say elaborate a bit more on that, and then we'll come back to say more things about the book. It's a really fascinating book. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Do you want me to read actually a section?
Yes, please.
Okay, I just have to find the page. So as I mentioned, the book is called Everything I Learned. I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. It's divided into 3 different sections of 8 stories each, 8 in elementary school, 8 in high school, and then 8 in college. And this story, or this excerpt I'm going to read from a story, actually takes place during the college years. Just to set the scene for you, this was the 80s. You know, by that time, I'd seen a lot of, death and destruction growing up in Detroit, and particularly with AIDS coming about as a gay person, it was a really scary time to be. And so when it came time to graduate high school and apply to college, I didn't think I would go to college because I didn't understand the point of sitting in a classroom for another 4 years when I thought that I could possibly be dead by the end of the, decade. And so I just thought I was going to maybe get a car and just drive around the country. But again, my mom didn't have a lot of opportunities education wise, and she really wanted us to be able to go to school, get an education, and maybe find a different job because she didn't want us staying in the restaurant. And so, after a while, I just rationalized what would be me giving up 4 years of my life to a woman who gave up her whole life for me. And so I said to my mom, okay, fine, mom, I'll apply to college, but I'm only going to apply to one college. And if I don't get in, I'm not going. And she's like, okay, fine. You apply to Michigan. I'm like, okay, fine. So I applied to Michigan and sadly I got in. And so I ended up going to college. I didn't know what I was going to study because I was just kind of going for my mom. And I was the type of student that actually had to work full time and then go to school at night. And so interestingly, a lot of classes at 6 o'clock are creative writing classes. And so I did the math and I said, okay, if I studied poetry writing and if I only wrote haikus, I could graduate in fewer than 500 words. And so that was my whole goal of graduating college. And I guess I must have wrote a pretty mean haiku because I got into the creative writing program at U of M, which only took 20 students. And so it was a pretty elite program.
Okay.
And so I'm going to read a little excerpt from that section, if you don't mind.
Thank
Oh,
you.
one thing you should know is that all the chapters in the book are, well, you're supposed to read the book like a journey of going into the Chinese restaurant. That's why the opening line is "Welcome to Chung's for here to go," and the closing lines are the sentiment of "Please come again." But all the chapters are laid out like a Chinese menu, so the numbers may not make sense. But this is chapter M7. Being a creative writing major made me the literary expert at Chung's. That was inevitable, as my dad asked every customer, "Have you met our number 3? He's the writer in the family." Every time he mentioned my program, the number of students accepted got smaller and smaller. At some point, I expected him to say I was the only one on campus even allowed to own a pen. One week, one of our waiters was out sick. My younger siblings were busy with their weekend activities, so I was the one called in to help. I jumped at the chance of some home-cooked meals for a few days. I was running around the dining room, refreshing our customers' silver teapots, when a white middle-aged woman reached into her oversized bag and pulled out a colorful hardcover. "Have you read this book? It's so good." The Joy Luck Club, the recently released novel that featured a bunch of old, sassy Chinese ladies who like to eat, gossip, and play mahjong, could have easily been set in our back kitchen. Every time I came in to help at the restaurant, another diner, usually older and female, cited the most memorable characters, lines, and scenes. They all wanted to know if I was working on something similar. I was writing poetry, but they didn't care. To them, all writers were the same. They would squeal, "You could be the next Amy Tan." My mom turned out to be the biggest pusher. She rarely had a book in her hand, but the success of the Joy Luck Club convinced her that her life was a bestseller too. She followed me around the dining room, dropping stories from her childhood, the same ones I'd heard growing up, but now she recounted them as if she was auditioning for her own books on tape. One night, after seeing how our waiters sometimes pooled their tips together, my mom shared an oldie. When the communists marched south, they targeted my family. My uncles and grandpa were rich in America, so the Red Guard called us traitors. My stubborn grandma didn't want to leave her big home, so when my parents escaped to Hong Kong, they left me behind to keep her company. The communists hated me and my pawpaw. When I was 4, they made me watch as they forced my grandma to climb the old banyan tree in our courtyard. Then they pushed her off into a pile of broken glass. For a visual, my mom rubbed her knees. Another time, standing at the water station, she launched into her own nautical tale. When I was 5, my uncle in America paid $25,000 in renminbi, the king's ransom in people's money, to local fishermen to ferry our remaining family out of China. After a long ride tucked under the planks of his fishy fishing boat, we came up for air. But we weren't in Hong Kong. The trader had turned us into the authorities. In jail, I had to sing Communist Party songs to earn extra rice for me and my grandma. Another chapter came as we stood beneath a painting of the Chinese countryside. When my pawpaw and I were freed from jail, we found that the officials had given away our home to peasants. We were forced to live several villages away in a dirt hut with 3 other families. Whenever we went out for a pail of water, my grandma had to bend low to keep her head below the soldiers. Once again, she gave me a demonstration, this time bowing her head. Granted, my mom's epic saga interested me. Who wouldn't be intrigued by tales of prison cells, guns, and stolen ransoms? Even the parts about her mundane life in Hong Kong after she was reunited with her parents and siblings were amusing. But these were her stories, not mine. She had to tell them, not me. I was in school to find my own voice. I sat and listened, but that was as far as it would go. Toward the end of the summer, as I was at the back table sipping my red pop, stockpiling poems for the upcoming semester, my mom sat down. Before I could say anything, she started talking. I was a top student in Hong Kong. When Pepsi came to town, they held a big contest for students to draw a picture of their own school. Mine was the best at Sacred Heart. I won 6 cases. There were so many bottles, I had to give some to the nuns. I threw down my Parker pen, the one I treated myself to after getting into the program. Yes, and they kept burping all day. It was so funny. You've told me that story over and over, and I don't even like Pepsi. I prefer Coke. My mom's shoulders shriveled. The shine faded from her rosy cheeks. You don't want to hear my story? I tensed. I do, but I'm behind on my own stuff. Between working at Drake's, the Journal, and Saving the World, my schedule was packed. On top of that, my workshops in the fall were advanced. Still insecure about my place in the program, I put pressure on myself to create more interesting writing by staying up late and scribbling in my notebook every detail of my life. But no matter how hard I tried, working harder could not produce a better poem. My mom lifted herself off her seat. The glint in her eyes orphaned me. Her 42 years of life flashed before my eyes. She'd gone from Guangzhou to Hong Kong to Detroit and spent the past 2 decades raising her 6 children in a hostile foreign land. She tried to prove that her life had worth, that it hadn't gone unnoticed, and here I was, the ungrateful son, writing it off. Her lips quivered in a soft murmur. I hastily picked up my pen, backtracking. Go ahead, Mom. I'll write it down this time. My mom bowed her head, as if I were one of the soldiers holding a gun to her temple, ordering her to sing. No, you go on. You do your own thing. I reached out my hand, but by then she had disappeared through the black swinging door, leaving only the rattling from the kitchen, the clanging walks, and the rumbling dishwasher. I sat there upset at myself for being so inconsiderate. Everything I'd done in the past 3 years had been for her, but it seemed as though I had failed the final test. My education wasn't just to help me get a better life. It was for my whole family. We were a team. We were the 8 immortals. How could I let them down? I needed to make things right. But I knew that, like most disappointments in our house, apologies were never spoken. Only deeds would bring about reconciliation. That's an excerpt from the story.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So that's actually very interesting because I was going to be asking you, which part of your book was the most enjoyable to write. When you read this, excerpt, is this a part of that most enjoyable part to write? And also, of course, as a follow-up to that question, the question is, was there the most difficult part to write?
No, was not the most enjoyable part to write, but I read that because I feel like, I want to tell my mom's story because she's the one that
Yes.
always encouraged me,
Yeah.
even from a young age to tell that story. So I do it for my mom. And so
Mhm.
that people know my mom and how much sacrifice she made for my siblings. But it
Yeah.
definitely wasn't the easiest to write. When I first started writing the book, as I mentioned, it was just for my family,
Yeah.
and so a lot of it was just humor stories, right? Like the funny,
Yeah.
goofy things that we did. But I tried to sell that book, but it was very hard to find an agent, right? Because
Mhm.
people didn't really care about a family owning a Chinese restaurant in Detroit. But
Mhm.
it's after I was getting rejected by all these agents and they were giving me feedback and stuff like that, that I decided to, age up the character from just middle school to also include high school and college, which
Mhm.
are more difficult ages in life because you're grappling with more serious subjects,
Mhm.
particularly, racism, homophobia, sexual orientation coming out. And so the book ended up being a much more difficult book to write in general. So I
Mhm.
would have to say my favorite parts of writing are really just, telling the jokes, the funny scenes. Those I just really, really have so much fun doing. Um, but
Yeah, there were a
when you're
lot of humor in the book. That's very true. Yeah.
Yeah, those are the best things. That's what I like. And as a writer, it's like anytime I come up with a phrase that I like, I think about it over and over as I'm just walking or just,
Yeah.
existing. I just think, and I have a certain amount of pride, like think, wow, that's a really good line. It makes me think of things, you know. Like I have this line in there where I sometimes think where I have this line where I say, yes, America succeeded because of yeah, yes, my family succeeded because of America, but America also succeeded because of my family.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like, I think of these lines that make me feel good. But the most difficult parts of the book are probably like the relationship between my mom and dad. I mean, they had an arranged marriage.
Mhm.
Um, you know, uh, and it's complicated when you have those type of relationships, right?
Yep.
Um,
And
you
you
know,
are also the third of the six children, right, in the family, and you'll have to be part of that relationship. Yep.
Yeah, being a middle child is difficult. I mean, you're trying to find your own space. You
Mhm.
find out your place where you are. And that's why that opening line, welcome to Chung's for here to go, is so significant because I think everybody goes through that at some point in their life. It's like, do I stay where I'm at or do I go? So I try to take that very common phrase that you hear going into a restaurant and I try to infuse it with like more depth and meaning. And
Oh
so
yeah,
for me, definitely.
that's a great opening. Like the your opening there for here or to go, right? That's like a lifelong question. We all been asking ourselves, and that's such a great metaphor. It's almost like going back to the Shakespeare's "to be or not to be," and
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for comparing me to Shakespeare.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
I,
gonna
I
tell that to
really, I
people
mean,
now.
like you said, these phrases, they're sort of like that's sort of like pinpoints, and also in this, they're dotted through the book, and you pick them
I'm
up,
gonna
and
say
yeah,
I'm gonna say this professor from BYU from BU compared me to Shakespeare. So I'm
okay.
gonna brag about that now.
Yeah. And so yeah, that's interesting because you mentioned about this. I remember actually that somewhere I think you were going to study pre-law, and then now you are the creative writing, and this and that. So the other interesting thing is, the title said everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. Back in the May Heritage Month, AAPI Heritage Month, local, GBH, one of the radio TV station here, had an event on the AAPI, Heritage Month. So we listened to Celeste Yin, right? And so she wrote,
Mm,
her first book is like Everything I Never Told You, right? And then yours is
mm.
Everything I Learned. So I was trying to think about, say, okay, so here's the thing about in her flavor, what story didn't make into your book? You didn't tell us.
Well, I mean, a lot. I mean, so
Sure.
when I first started the project, I actually sent myself an email
Uh-huh.
with the title I learned at Chung's, right? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that changed a little bit, but it's kind of the same title. But then I listed like maybe 20 or 30 stories that I thought were the funniest or the most happy memories of growing up in that restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
But really, only about three of those stories ended up in the book. So I
Okay.
threw away those things. And then, when I found an agent and I turned in my first draft,
Mm-hmm.
you know, she threw out maybe about a third of the book. And then when I when we sold the book, the editor threw out another 3 stories. I mean, and they always had me replace it with something because I was going by that 888 structure. So yeah, so some of the choices were not even really my own. But if one of them suggested dropping something, and if I didn't want to drop it, they would say to me, well, then it's up to you to make it work. Then you've got to find a way to make that story fit in with the arc, right? You got to find the story so it doesn't seem out of place or irrelevant. And so I think maybe 1 or 2 of the things they suggested, I fought to keep in, and they ended up staying in. So that was good.
I mean, the point is right this, right? I mean, people read your book and they're fascinated by the story, right? Some point in time, you know, when they meet you, for example, at the book reading events and this, they might also be interesting to hear what are the things that not in the book, you know, your editor and this all have. But then you also said, you know, there's some compelling, interesting stories that you like to share with your fans, your audience, and the readers as well, right? So that's sort of like the ways, you know, we're thinking. So in that regard, you know, you mentioned that you have done more than 250 book reading events for this book, right? I think you came to Boston a couple of times. And oh yeah, before I forgot, I need to get this out of my memory thing is that day when we met, you said you're going back to Detroit to film about cooking a dish. What was that? Do you remember that? You know, that was back in July, end of, you know, end of
Yeah,
July.
do you want me to talk about that or the tour?
Yeah, no, so why don't you, I mean, so that is for my personal question. I want to see what were you, you know, you said you're going to do a filming about cooking a dish, right? And then I keep trying to remembering what the you talk about, and then we'll come back about your book reading events. Yeah, so
Yeah, so one of the funny things is that if you read the book, you'll know that I was the worst cook in the family. Like everybody all could do something except for me. When the family got together to cook breakfast, I was the one kicked into the dining room to go set the table. But it's funny though, that I've written this book. I'm now the food expert. Like I got a piece for Bon Appetit that got selected for Best American Food Writing. What you're talking about is I was invited by this show called America's Test Kitchen. It's a cooking show on PBS. They asked me to produced an episode of their podcast, which was about, you know, in the book, I talk about this dish called almond boneless chicken, which is very specific to Detroit. Like every Chinese restaurant in Detroit has it, but you can't really find it in many places outside. And so they said, can you prove that your grandmother actually invented this dish? Right. And so I had to go through, do a little bit of digging, right? Like, fortunately, my family kept the menus all the way back to the 1930s. You know, so I could see when it appeared. You know, I found restaurant menus from other places to sort of cross over. You know what I mean? So, yeah, that was the journey. So it's a dish called almond boneless chicken, and if you want to, you can Google America's Test Kitchen and find the podcast.
Yeah. So actually, we were actually earlier trying to do something with American Test Kitchen. And so that's also the connection, like for me, I said, oh, shit, I remember Curtis talked about American Test Kitchen too. So
Well, they
that's
asked me to come
interesting.
back. They said if I have another idea for another episode that, you know, I'm
Okay.
happy to pitch. Yeah, it was a really smooth process. I really enjoyed working with them, and I think they liked working with me. So if you have any ideas you want me to cover, just let me know. I'll pitch it to them.
Yeah, because they're sort of local to us, you know, and then so that's a part of the interesting thing. And then to me, I knew it was not kung pao chicken, but I was trying to remember what was it. Now it makes sense because it's a Detroit specific dish, so we don't really see it as often here. Again, so yeah, we mentioned like you've done this so many book reading events. Even today, we're hoping to have this as an in-person book reading event, and hope you will come back to do that as well. But can you also say among all these events, what are, some of your favorite moments, and experience the interacting with the readers and the fans, of this book?
Well, the one thing I have to say is that the best part about this journey has been able to connect with our former customers because sadly, our restaurant closed very quickly. Despite the fact that it had been running for over 60 years, I was working in LA at the time, and my dad called me and told me on the phone, I'm closing the restaurant at the end of the week. And I'm like, what do you mean by that? And he was like explaining like, oh, there's just too many things that need to be fixed, da, 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 da. And I said, okay, fine. If you decide to close the restaurant, that's up to you, but you have to wait another month so that you can give all your former customers a chance to come in and say goodbye or say whatever. But he didn't want to do that. He just closed it down. And so I was really angry at my dad for a long time for doing that. And that's part of what my next book will be about. My relationship with my dad. But because our customers never got a chance to say goodbye, I sort of see this book tour that I've been on as a chance to reconnect with those people and to literally thank them for supporting my family and the restaurant and giving me and my siblings these wonderful lives. One story that I love telling is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at the end of this packed reading at Porter Square Books, this woman, I think she's about 60 years old or so, gets up, and she's a white woman, and she's like, has anybody here ever eaten at Chung's? And nobody had, because we're in Massachusetts. And then she says, I grew up in Detroit. That was my family's favorite restaurant. We went there every Sunday. She's Jewish, right? And she's like, we went there every Sunday. And when she told her mom that she was coming to my reading, her mom, who has dementia now, started recounting all of our dishes in vivid details. And she said for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had her mom back. And so for me, it's these special moments of reconnecting with people. And then also understanding it's like when you run a family business like that, you develop these relationships with your customers, particularly if it's been around for decades. It's like you almost become, a wing of their family. And that's also very special too. And so it just makes me appreciate the work that my parents did and my family did to help build community, right? And a safe place for people to feel good about themselves, and to get on with their lives. And so, it just makes me very proud to be someone from a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah, that's a really, really moving, story. And so we talked about the restaurant, the food, you mentioned about the chances like a Disneyland in Detroit, the happiest place on earth. But then that's where obviously, you call yourself Curtis from Detroit. And so Detroit has affected you a lot. And and then we cannot help but also talking about what happened in Detroit, right, in the 1980s, especially with Vincent Chang and this. And so this is some of the heavy stuff, but it's really, when we introduce you, we also said Curtis is a, activist, in addition to author, filmmaker, and this and that. So can you say, say some of these, say some things about how Detroit affect you and the Vincent thing. And I think there's a deep family connection to Vincent as well. Yeah.
Well, I love Detroit, and it's been one of the response that the Detroiters have given me to my book. Before we launched, the Detroit Historical Museum put together an exhibit on Detroit's Chinatown to coincide with my book. Since then, I've given talks to so many places, including places like the Detroit Lions, Detroit Pistons, Ford Motor Company, Kresge Foundation. The Historical Society of Michigan had me do the keynote. I mean, it's just been really, the state of Michigan gave it an award as a notable book from Michigan about Michigan last year. So it's just been really wonderful how the city has embraced me. And I did write it as a Detroit memoir. So if you grew up in Detroit or you have any familiarity, with the 80s, you're going to relate to the book in a lot of different ways. And so I wanted to do that, partly to show that, my family went through all that too. We're, it's a very American story in that way. I think the story you're talking about is the Vincent Chin story and how that had an impact on me. For people who aren't familiar with it, in the 80s, Detroit was going through a lot of difficulties because of the car industry. And a lot of people were blaming the Japanese, which, their companies had overtaken the Americans as the largest auto producer in the world. And because of that, a lot of people pointed their fingers, made accusations. Because of that, that led to a lot of tension or anti-Asian sentiments. And Vincent was a Chinese American celebrating his upcoming wedding. At some point, he goes to the strip club, but at some point, these two white auto workers come in and they're overheard saying it's because of your mother blanks that we're out of work. They're kicked to the bar, but then these two guys get in their car and they drive around the streets of Detroit trying to track down Vincent. And sadly, they find him sitting outside of a McDonald's waiting for his ride to pick him up. They take a baseball bat out of their car and they bash Vincent's head in. And you know, our families were friends. My uncle was his best man. And so the very next morning, we found out, you know, that he was in the hospital struggling, fighting for his life. And you know, when you're a 14-year-old kid and you know somebody that's, you know, in the hospital like that, you're gonna check the newspaper, right? You're gonna check the radio and the TV to find out what they say about it. We didn't have the internet back then, so we can do that. But you know, the media did not cover that story. Next day, they didn't cover it all. Next day, nothing, 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 nothing. It took them 12 whole days before they reported on that case. In the same time period, all the people in the Chinese community were coming into our restaurant, trying to find out any details that they could, like what happened, who was there, et cetera, et cetera. And that contrast between what our Chinese American community cared about and what the mainstream media was covering was really stark to me. So that several months later, when the judge came back with a sentence of only $3,000 fine and not having to serve a day in jail, you know, I connected the dots and said, well, it's because he doesn't see us. He doesn't know who we are. You know what I mean? He doesn't know our story. And I don't have a problem with the judge showing compassion for the killers. I have some compassion for the two. I feel bad that you know that they did what they did, you know. But you know, I don't think the judge should never have allowed the compassion that he had for those killers to outweigh the compassion that he had for Vincent and Vincent's fiance and Vincent's mom and our community. And I think that's my problem. And so that's why, you know, for me, I've been on this mission throughout my life to help Asian Americans tell our stories, because I think that when people know us, they know our story, they know who we are, then it becomes harder for them to attack us. But when they do attack us, then at least the people in the justice system will know to protect us and to get justice for us, because they see us as people worthy of equality in this country.
Yeah, that's the you know the Vincent. So here in Lexington, we actually during the pandemic, we had you know a whole webinar dedicated to the memory of Vincent Chin. Revisit that because we all know during the pandemic there's the resurgence or the whatever the surfacing of the anti-Asian hate. So a lot of that is a parallel to that. And I think in your book, you also, in some of other places, you also mentioned that, these things, it's not new, right? I mean, I remember in your book, you actually said, for example, Chinese Exclusion Act was not explicit, said or mentioned, but everybody knew that was a limiting, factor in a lot of the people, the Chinese Americans' life here. So can you say a few words about how that, from the history through the tumultuous times in Detroit in the 80s to nowadays, what is our community, what we should do as Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, or just as Americans? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I always say that, so my family's been in this country since the 1800s, and I always say that the discrimination that my great-great-grandfather faced when he came to this country is not that dissimilar to the discrimination that I might face, right? Like where you're from, what's your loyalty, you're a foreigner, can you really assimilate? In the case of COVID, you bring diseases, right? You're dirty. So the stereotypes have not changed much, right? Like throughout, whether it's Vincent Chin or what was going on through COVID. But what has changed? Well, and I also say that sadly, I think that we will always have racism in this country. It's just part of being in America. But the good news, though, and why I'm optimistic is that you just have to look at how far our community has come since the Vincent Chin Day, and how in a lot of ways you can say that our community also failed Vincent Chin, right? Because our community did not fight up for him early enough. We waited until after the judge sentenced them, and by that time it's too late, right? As soon as it was attacked, and as soon as that first article appeared, we probably should have followed up on that story, right? The journalists in town should have been held accountable to keep following that story to make sure that the ball wasn't dropped. We should have been organizing rallies and things like that. But the problem is we waited too late. But the good news is, like, when things have happened recently, whether it's the rash of hate crimes or, what happened in Atlanta with the spa shooting, or Indianapolis when they shot up the mail center, our community didn't wait. We were on top of it. You know what I mean? And so you look at those changes.
Yeah, that's
across the
actually very true. I think in Atlanta, I think the shooting happened on a Tuesday, and on Saturday here in Lexington, we had a vigil, and then
exactly.
actually it's a nationwide vigil. It's a part of the nationwide vigils, to get our voice heard, to rally and to support each other. Yeah, you're
Well,
very right.
we have a community, we have the
Yeah.
infrastructure. So you're talking about having Asian Americans working in the newsroom who are
Mhm.
covering, hear about these stories and tell their editors, we need to cover this story, right? Or whether you have Asian American celebrities who can use social media to elevate and make sure these stories are repeated over and over and over so more people hear about it. Whether you're talking about the network of nonprofit organizations like your organizations, right?
Mhm.
Who are encouraging their members to speak out, right? To keep numbers about these things, whether you're talking about elected officials. We have so many more Asian American elected officials. We can pass legislation now. We have Asian American business leaders who are forming foundations to channel money towards some of these efforts. You just look at it across the board. Our community is just so much better prepared. And we still have a way to grow. We still have to develop stronger ties and stronger respect because we're still not completely respected by the all the elected officials and different entities of power in this country. But it's definitely much better than it was 40 years ago. So
Yes.
in that
Yeah.
sense, I'm optimistic.
Yeah, so that's great. That's actually something about hopeful for the future. So I like
Mhm.
to, like I know you have an airplane to catch, and we also want to leave some time for the audience. But let me ask you something, right? So towards the end of your book, the last chapter, your first chapter started with for here to go. The last chapter, your family sent you on a train to New York, and your mom and your parents also, your family all said, go, 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 right? And then the idea is, where are you going? So, and then it's interesting you name that chapter as a typical, menus from Chinese, right? The fortune cookies. So this is about the future. So, can you say a few things about your plan or where the future holds? And then what do you hope, the readers take away from the book? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate. I mean, even though I grew up in a very tough time for my hometown, I do
Mm-hmm.
tell people that I wouldn't trade it for anything. I feel like I had the best childhood, and that's because of my family.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they really grounded me. And so I feel very, very lucky. In terms of what are my next steps,
Mm-hmm.
so the book came out in October. I've done over 250 events around the world, or not, well, in the US and Europe. I'm doing some stuff in Asia in the fall, but it's been really, really well received. The book is already in its third printing after 8 months, and that's a pretty
Wow.
fast pace. I mean, so that's great. It's gotten all this great media attention. My paperback actually comes out October 1st, and to celebrate, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 24 more readings, including probably a couple in the Boston area, but I'm going to
Okay.
do 24 more readings, but they're all going to be in Chinese restaurants around the country. And my conversation partner are all going to be the owners or the staff, so they can share their stories, right? Because
Yep.
yeah, and then I want to film it and produce an 8-part docuseries on the history of Chinese restaurants in America, charting their path
Mm-hmm.
and comparing it through the immigration waves, starting with the original Say Yup, the Cantonese that came in, to
Yep.
the Taiwanese that came in the 60s after the immigration change, after we normalized relationship with China, different regions of China started coming in, including the
Mm-hmm.
Fujianese,
Yep.
to globalization, which now brings a different class of Asians coming in. I mean, so it's just really fascinating how you can understand not just the Asian or Chinese American community, but also America looking at Chinese restaurants, and their policies and things like that. And so that's my next project. So if anybody has any suggestions for restaurants in your area, shoot me an email. If you guys know anybody that'd be interested in supporting this documentary with a nonprofit tax deductible donation, please have them contact me as well. But I'm very excited about that.
That's truly exciting. And then I think it demonstrated your, love of food and then the commitment and also this community. And this can be the great conversation vehicles. So Helen, so I think, thank you for, putting this all together. I think we should, leave some time for the audience to ask some questions. And given that, Curtis is going to try to catch an airplane soon. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you, Curtis and Hua. We do have some questions. So Judy is a native Detroiter, and you have a Michigan writing student. So she said she's a bit older than you, but she was wondering where in the city your family's restaurant was.
Oh, do you know the Cass Corridor? Cass and Peterborough? It's they're trying to rebrand it as Midtown now, but it'll always be corridor to me.
Yeah, Judy said yes. Yeah.
She said yes.
That's a new Chinatown, right? Because the old Chinatown, they took it down, build the highways and this and that, right? So
Yeah, the original Chinatown had as many as 4,000 people, but like you said, in the late 50s, the US, a lot of them were destroying the Chinatowns to build freeways to connect, the people that the white flight to their jobs still in the city. And so Detroit, they destroyed it. And they moved to this new area called the Cass Corridor. And that Chinatown never got more than 400 or 500 people. It was much smaller. It was a shadow of the old Chinatown. And the other thing too, though, it wasn't all Chinese. It was actually developed as a Pan-Asian international district. So you had a lot of Indians and Filipinos there too.
Thanks. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about growing up as a ABC, American-born Chinese. Sounds like you had a very supportive family, but also where did you find the support to embrace your identity as a young, gay, American-born Chinese, whether family or in the community?
Well, I mean, in the book, I talk about how, when my family moved from a more racially mixed area to one that was all white, that was like 98% white, I had to really figure out where I fit in there, right? And the best way to fit in is sometimes just adopting what the dominant kids are saying and doing. And so I decided to become a young Republican at that time. I was the Asian Alex P. Keaton, if that means anything to the listeners here. I was like senior class president of the National Honor Society. I co-founded the Young Republican Club, the Students Against Smoking. Margaret Thatcher was my imaginary girlfriend. I was a total right winger. But that's what I thought was how I would fit in. But then, when you get older, you realize that fitting in should not be the goal in life. Understanding who you are should be the goal. And once you figure that out, then you will find the right people to be with, right? Otherwise, you're just fitting in, you're just adopting things that you probably don't believe and probably aren't good for you sometimes. And so that's what that's part of the journey of that book is like, how do I come into my own voice? Like, how do I, stop just being influenced by the things around me just because it made my life temporarily easier, right, to get along with the people. Sometimes you have to do the hard thing of standing up, and saying, I don't agree with you, right? And that's not easy when you're a kid in high school, right? Because everybody just wants to fit in.
Right, definitely. And it sounds like there was a lot of support in your community, but can you talk a little bit about the racial makeup of this community where your parents owned Chung's, and how you supported each other?
Well, I mean, Detroit's a racially polarized city. Chinese restaurants are diverse, right? Because our clients, we accepted everybody. And so I got to see both black and white parts of the community. But even today, I think the Asian population in Michigan is only 4%. I mean, it was much smaller back then. So I don't know what it was, probably 1%, 2% back then. Very, very small. Um, I've always thought of myself as Asian because all the different Asian groups always hung out together. Like even when we went out to that school that was like 400 kids, 98% white, like all the Asian kids hung out together. I jokingly say it's because we were all in the same advanced math and science classes, but there's some jokey to that, but there's some truth to it. Is that we all felt comfortable and safe with each other, right? We, similar parents, and similarly feeling like an outsider, and so yeah, that's where I found solace. But I was popular enough to be senior class president, so it's not like I only made friends with the Asians, right? I made friends with everybody. And that's one of the things that I learned working in that Chinese restaurant is like, how do you make connections with people who are different from you? Like, how do you get people to connect, with you? And so, I was able to use the skills that I learned in the Chinese restaurant to navigate that.
Sounds like you met quite a lot of people at that Chinese restaurant.
Well, that's part of it. There's so many of our customers, whether it's the first mayor Coleman Young to Oscar-winning actor Yul Brenner to like the pimps and prostitutes and drag queens, the Jewish families. I mean, there's so many different people that would come in and they all make cameos, in the book. So
that
there's a little
segues
bit
into
of
my
everything.
question about who's the most memorable person you met in the restaurant.
Well, I mean, the Yul Brenner stories seems to be pretty popular. It was an age when I was trying to find a strong, positive Asian male role model on TV, and there weren't really very many. And one fall, Yul Brenner was coming into town to perform in The King and I, and he booked our family's restaurant to have his cast party. And my dad got so excited because he's like, oh my God, this Oscar-winning actor wants to, have his party at our restaurant. And he sort of had a chip shop. My dad had a chip on his shoulder, thinking that Chinese restaurants didn't get the respect that other cuisines got. So he like spent the whole week like making sure the place was as clean as possible. Or he made us clean up, made sure it was clean as possible. Like he even bought ice cream for Yul Brenner. It's like he never bought ice cream for us. Like, my dad was really trying to pull out all the stops. But then, when Yul Brenner showed up that night, he was a total, can I swear on this?
Probably not.
Okay.
He's not a very nice person. I'll put it that way. Okay. So, yeah. And so to me, the moral of that story was that everybody was spending that whole night trying to, hold up Yul Brenner as this idol, as this some image that we should all be aspiring to. In reality, it's the Chinese waiter, the guy who's just trying to make sure everybody has a good night, right? And is happy and is fulfilled. Their stomachs are full. Maybe that's the hero that we need to worship in this society, and not the celebrities. So that was my lesson. So that's the story in the book.
That's a great lesson. We have some comments. June says it's a very touching story, and Rachel wants to know what email address she should send suggestions for restaurants for you to interview.
Yeah, send it to info@Curtis from Detroit. I know some people are saying, oh, go to this place called Kowloon because that's like a tiki theme
Yeah,
restaurant.
Cajon is in Saugus. It's a sort of like a local landmark. Yeah.
People have been suggested Pearl River, down in Chinatown. But I want to cover a regional dish that you guys have in Massachusetts. I can't remember the name of it, but there's a specific chicken dish. I think it was in Springfield, Massachusetts. That where it was discovered. I think it was called the chow mein sandwich or something like that.
Okay.
I have to look it up. It's in my notes, but so out of the restaurants that I'm choosing, I'm not necessarily always choosing the oldest restaurant. I have to choose around the country, particular restaurants that each fit in within a certain wave of that immigration.
Yeah, so that's actually interesting. Let me jump in with a question. When you choose restaurant, does the restaurant have to have noodles on the menu? Because it's very interesting, right? You talk about yourself being superstitious. You always order noodle dishes.
Well, I always eat noodle because noodle is good long life. I mean,
Yeah.
my dad died at a young age because he stopped eating noodles because he was diabetic, and so he cut noodles out of his life. So I decided I'm never cutting noodles out of my life. I'm always going to eat noodles. But maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a broad, thing. I mean, so, even there'll be an episode on, like Chinese food that went to a third country and then came to America. Like, for instance, there's a lot of Peruvian food that's actually Chinese in origin, right? Or even like jjajangmyeon in Korean, or even shumai in Japan. You know what I mean? Like there are all these other dishes that we think of as being other cuisines, but they're actually Chinese in origin, right?
Yep.
So I'll have an episode on that. So yeah, throw out different suggestions, and I'll just got to see if they pair up, with what I'm doing. Kowloon would be a good place, except the tiki restaurant that I want to do is the one that my family owns in Detroit. That was founded by my dad's cousin in 1953. So I think that one might take up that slot. Sorry.
Well, Curtis needs to catch a plane, and so we just want to thank Curtis for sharing his memoir with us today, and thank Hua for moderating this wonderful discussion. Please read Curtis's book, and we look forward to your next project, and hopefully we'll be talking again soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hua, for excellent moderation. Thank you, Helen, for pulling us all together. And
Yeah,
look forward
that's
to
it. Yeah, like
please.
I said, I have my own copy of book. I was hoping you'd come here to sign it, but I'll see you in DC near end of the month, and I'll bring the book and I'll have you sign it. Thank you, Curtis. Yeah,
Thank you
Bye.
so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Have a good evening. Bye.
thank you.